Centuries back, when cartographers would reach the edge of the known world on their maps, they would occasionally draw a sea monster and label the area, "Here there be dragons." It was a creative way of saying, we don't know what's over here. It was uncharted. There were unknown risks that way. It can serve as a remarkable metaphor for the experiences like grief and trauma. I am, of course, going to talk about how this pandemic has been like sailing in uncharted waters, but the metaphor applies to so many other situations that we have of fear and suffering in our lives. Whether it is a personal crisis like an illness, a sudden job loss, or the death of a loved one, or a more systemic tragedy such as the unexpected experience of systemic oppression or an abrupt impact of capitalism run amok, we can get caught off guard. We can be thrown unexpectedly into uncharted waters. This ongoing pandemic is certainly one such example that we are all experiencing now. We are off the edge of the map. We are in uncharted waters. Beware, here there be dragons. Thankfully, many of us have a healthy capacity to manage risk and uncertainty. Many of us can deal with quite a bit, can be resilient, can reframe things to keep moving forward when faced with trouble. And there are also times when it can be too much, when we can become lost and floundering in the chaotic surge of trauma and uncertain difficulties. I want to talk about what we can do at such times. During our Time for All Ages this morning, I showed the children an old navigational instrument, a sextant, and I talked with them a bit about geometry that's involved in that and how it works, but I particularly wanted to share with them how you can find your way by the stars, and that the stars are like our values, our guiding ideals that can lead us through uncertainty. Now, I didn't really get into this part, but with the stars as our values, the tools and instruments, such as a sextant or a GPS, are like the people around us who can help us in that discernment process, to sort through our situation with us. And when I say that we have people around us who can help, I mean a friend, a family member, a therapist, all good choices when seeking help when you are in troubled times, when you are in uncharted waters. I would like to suggest someone a little different, though. I want to lift up an exemplar from history. Historic figures can serve as exemplars with lessons to help us through our troubles. So, Sir Ernest Shackleton is one such person, like a navigational instrument for me, helping me understand the impact of my values in a given situation. If you are unfamiliar with Sir Ernest Shackleton, let me offer you just a brief sketch of him. He was a polar explorer. He and his shipmates set out to cross Antarctica in 1914. A few years before the Endurance sailed from England, two other explorers had already reached the South Pole within a few weeks of each other, as it happens. And apropos of my larger point, Amundsen is considered the first man to have reached the South Pole. Scott is considered the second, arriving 5 weeks after Amundsen. But in truth, Scott was not the second person to reach the South Pole. He was the sixth. Amundsen, who reached the South Pole first, was part of a team of 5 people who reached the South Pole in December of 1911. History ought to be more attentive to the team rather than just the intrepid leader. My point in bringing up that small tangent is to highlight how a couple of years later, Ernest Shackleton is remembered not for crossing the continent, but for bringing his entire team back home. I don't look to Amundsen for wisdom in troubled times. I look to Shackleton. When I am struggling with this pandemic, for example, I think on Shackleton and how he brought his whole team home. It's worth noting, Shackleton was an explorer, an adventurer. He was not just someone who stayed safe and therefore kept his whole team safe. A ship in harbor is safe from the storm, but staying in harbor is not what a ship is for. Shackleton took great risks, not foolish risks, but certainly risks. The advertisement Shackleton put out to secure a crew for the Endurance is an amazing thing to read today. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. And with that, he had 5,000 people apply. The call to adventure and exploration. Shackleton was able to handpick his team carefully. The 28 men aboard the Endurance sailed south from England through the Atlantic to South Georgia Island. It's a small bit of land near the tip of South America. The ensuing expedition can be considered a trip away from that small island of South Georgia and back. It lasted roughly a year and a half. The Endurance left South Georgia in early December of 1914, and it crossed the Antarctic Circle about a week later, and then 5 weeks after that was well and truly trapped in the solid pack ice, less than 100 miles from the continent itself. In all that happened after that, the expedition never reached Antarctica proper. I find it most interesting that this expedition to cross Antarctica through the South Pole is not remembered by what they failed to accomplish, but by the remarkable thing that they did accomplish instead. They failed to cross the continent. It was another 40 years before a team successfully crossed the continent through the pole. What Shackleton did instead, the reason he is remembered, is that the expedition team survived and made it home. 6 weeks in, he and his team were stuck, and the remainder of that 18-month-long story was spent working on how to get back out alive. It's very similar to the Apollo 13 space flight in that regard. NASA described that 1970 Apollo 13 flight as a successful failure. They did not accomplish their original goal, that shuttle, and their mission almost ended in disaster, but they survived. The ingenuity and resourcefulness and commitment of everyone involved made it possible for those astronauts to return to Earth alive. They never made it to the moon. That part was a failure. They learned a lot about how to respond to the extreme crisis, and everyone made it back to Earth. That part was the success. Here's one of the lessons that I learned from Shackleton. We should still strive. We should still take risks, still attempt for the wild and improbable goals. And if it all falls apart, we can take a step back and make new goals and keep going. We are in this pandemic now, and our congregation has chosen to take the risk of meeting in person indoors as well as online. Many UU congregations are making many different choices in that regard. Some are meeting outside only. Others are indoors, in person, and online, like us. Others are online only. There is no guiding rule from the UUA at this point because each congregation's situation is a little bit different. in terms of what's happening in the communities around our congregations, and in terms of the needs and the capacity for risk of the people in the congregations. The in-person component of our worship is a risk that we have chosen to take at this point. It is good to take risks in life. It's also good to make changes when new information about the risk comes to light. That's what Shackleton did, and that's what I aim to do. I'm not saying we're about to make a change to our in-person worship this week, but I am saying it's something we know may become necessary. For now, we, like Shackleton, are settled into our new normal. For the men on the Endurance, the situation was a waiting game. They were stuck in the ice. Shackleton imagined that they might have to spend the season there waiting for warmer weather, and that became the new plan, to wait it out. It turns out they were trapped in that ice for 10 months, drifting with the pack ice northwest. Shackleton had invested a lot of time and energy keeping the spirits of the crew up during that time. He set work for the crew, creating and maintaining a camp on the pack ice, as well as keeping the ship in good repair and ready for when the ice broke. He visited with every member of the crew regularly, and in the evenings they played chess and bridge, and they sang songs, and occasionally put together events like feasts and skits and derbies. It was at the end of October 1915 when the ship finally was crushed by the pressure from the ice, and a month later it sank. But that's not the end of their story. We're only about halfway through their tale. The second half of their voyage occurred without their ship. When the Endurance finally broke apart and sank, Shackleton ordered them to abandon the ship, and he said to the crew, "Ship and stores have gone, so now we go home." Just like that. The plan to wait out the ice with the ship fell apart, and Shackleton came up with a new plan. They took the 3 longboats, whaling longboats, and struck out across the ice. They dragged the boats across the ice or rowed them through treacherous ice lanes. Ultimately, the goal was unchanged: bring the crew home. But now it was no longer by waiting here with the ship. The new plan lasted another 5 months as they made their way north slowly and carefully, either in the boats or dragging them. Eventually, they reached the end of the pack ice and struck out into the open ocean. They spent another week dodging icebergs and ice floes and made it alive together to Elephant Island. They set up camp again, and then 5 of the men took one of the boats and sailed 800 miles back to South Georgia Island to secure a rescue for the rest of the crew. 800 miles. When was the last trip you took that was more than 15 miles around town? 800 miles. All told, it was an amazing journey filled with danger and heroism. Part of what we learn in the story is how we always have another choice we can make from moment to moment. We have within us the capacity to tap the remarkable strength and perseverance that we all have. And when we stick together and take care of each other, our chances of success expand. We have been in a crisis, several crises, actually. The pandemic, certainly, a fascist attempt to deconstruct our democracy, indeed, institutional racism pushing against our attempts to bring a progressive vision into reality. Our values lead us to speak the truth about what we see happening. Our faith calls us to participate in the struggle, but not to get lost in it. There's a lot going on that could cause us to get overwhelmed and lost. The example of Shackleton reminds us that it is worth it to take the risks. Such risks are the heart of living. We also are reminded to not be foolish in our risks. We do well to have our risks tempered by the wisdom of science and guided by the commitment to our communal well-being. Shackleton also reminds us that when we have made a plan and we have put ourselves into it fully, it's possible that plan will completely fall apart. And when that happens, our work is to let go of that old plan in favor of the new information, and to let go and make a new plan, and to keep going. The most poignant for this pandemic, perhaps no less poignant for our nation, the ultimate goal was to keep the whole team in mind as we go. This is heartbreaking to me because so many people have already died from COVID-19, but in my heart that is still my highest guiding star, to keep the whole community in mind, as safe as possible. We may cross the continent, we might not. We may meet in person from now on, we might not. We may grow as a faith community, we might not. We may dismantle white supremacy in our culture during my lifetime, and we might not. But this I know, we will see each other through as best we can together. We will take our ship into dangerous and uncharted waters again and again, and we will do all we can to bring all of us back home. In the end, Sir Ernest Shackleton summarized the expedition of the Endurance thus: "We have entered a year and a half before with a well-found ship, full equipment, and high hopes. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed, groveled down, yet grasped at glory, grown bigger in the bigness of the whole. We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders, and had reached the naked soul of man." And I notice that we here in our little congregation entered this pandemic a year and a half before with high hopes and a well-found building on the verge of being refitted. We've not had the harrowing journey that Shackleton experienced, but we have had our own share of struggles and suffering. Our journey is not finished. But with the wisdom and clarity of such good examples, and with faith that we are on the right path, I trust that we will make our way through the rest of this adventure together, ready for what awaits us next. In a world without end, may it be so.